So I'd like to welcome you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, to the RIHN International Symposium, The Arts of Living with Nature. My name is Daniel Niles. I'm Associate Professor of Geography here at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature. And I'd like to acknowledge at the outset that this symposium is the result of a collaborative endeavor with EHESS, the School of Advanced Social Studies, Social Sciences in France. I'm sorry, my French pronunciation is so bad that I do not attempt to give a proper pronunciation. But our colleagues there in France, we appreciate their efforts very much, especially that of Professor Frédéric Julian, who you will meet in the session to be held in a few hours from now. Well, we are here at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature, and I feel I should mention just a few words about our institute because we're quite a unique place. We are a national research institute, and our mission is to solicit, to fund, and to host fixed-term research projects. And RIHN is quite unique, especially in the sense that it takes a human-centered approach or a cultural approach to the study of environment and environmental problems. Our main subject of study is humanity in the midst of a dynamic and yet changeable nature. And with this view, we must consider always the cultural causes and effects of environmental change. So this is to say that environmental changes that we see in the world today may be intentional or accidental, but they always have to do with social values, social goals, and the human sense of well-being. And in this sense, the idea of transformation, of social ecological change, of redirecting the patterns of human environmental behavior is a very deeply cultural endeavor, and as such, a challenge to science as we know it. And it's really these ideas which inform the key symposium themes of our this year's symposium, The Arts of Living with Nature. Here, we really want to turn to the arts, and we define the arts very broadly. We like to assert the value of real life, vernacular, and artistic traditions and practices, which exist here in Japan in abundance and also in many other places around the world, alongside the deep traditions of human and natural science. And we want to do this in a way that enables a dialogue between these different kinds of knowledge and practice. And in particular here, we highlight the fact that many of these deep human traditions and practices exist in the cultural realm. That is, they can be found in real complexes, in real instances around the world, in such things as the gardens that we began our symposium with last night, and in food practices, in traditional arts and folk cultures, and so on. And our idea, the idea that's really being explored over the length of our 5 days of this symposium, is that these arts of life always express knowledge about the natural world and are therefore relevant now to our concerns to redirect the ways that different societies live with the earth. Now, as I mentioned, we had last night our opening session, and you can see here it was concerned with the earthly garden. And one of the key ideas to emerge from our discussion last night was that of the garden as a place to socialize, as the garden as a place of social exchange, as a place of dialogue, and not just a meeting place between people, but also for exchange with the realms beyond the humans, with the stones, the soils, the plants, animals, insects, and weather found there. And today we turn our attention to this realm of activity, more specifically to the non-human, with the simple idea, not with the simple idea that it can teach us about the workings of nature, but with the idea that the plants and animals of the world have their own forms of consciousness and cognition that challenge our human ways of knowing the world, including our human sense of self, as it also can expand our perception of the creative earth on its own terms. And so we turn today in the in this academic session of the morning to 3 researchers who are concerned with exactly these subjects. And so I would like to introduce, firstly, we will have 3, in these academic presentations, we have 3 20-minute discussions, a chance for a little more sustained and in-depth discussion of individual ideas. Whereas, as you see here, we have beginning this evening at 7 o'clock in Japan, a public session, which is structured much more around more free-flowing discussion across the symposium themes. And so we begin this morning with, or this evening, I'm sorry, as it is for Christine Webb, our first presenter, with the presentation, Leveling the Field in Primatology and Beyond. Now, Christine Webb joins us from Harvard University, where she is a member of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. She has investigated primates in a number of different settings over the last 15 years. And she's especially interested in how primates manage and resolve conflicts and what this process of conflict resolution says about their affective states, such as empathy and their jealousy, empathy and jealousy. And secondly, also, in related to this, she's interested in particular to reimagine the role of science and in the philosophies that are involved in doing so when we speak about the moral status of animals in the world today. And so, Christine, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So I'd like to welcome you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I know it's a little bit on the late side for you, so I appreciate very much you staying up to be with us. And I wonder if you would begin your presentation. Our friend, Professor Christoph RUPPRECHT of the Department of Environmental Design at Ehime University here in Japan. Christoph is formerly of the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature, was a member of the FEAST project on sustainable food systems of food production and consumption, has since gone on to the University of Ehime, and very much interested in the idea of multi-species sustainability, and is also involved at the moment in an exhibition which is just set to open next month, entitled Microbes Really Are All Around, which is to go on at the RIHN, that is the Future Museum, a National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation here in Tokyo. So Christoph, please, welcome.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And it's great to be back, even though only virtually. Thanks for having me today. And first, I'd like to acknowledge that this is not my work alone, but I'm presenting work that is coming out of collaborations with all kinds of different collaborators. And it's really not only my ideas I'm talking about here. And first, say I really love the theme of the symposium this year, and I think it's a really important theme. It's exactly the kind of work that, as a former RIHN member, I would like to see RIHN do more of. And so today I'd like to pick up the topic of both earthly intelligence and gardening and arts of living to talk about modern human gardening for multi-species sustainability. And as a short synopsis, first I'll start by reflecting on the idea of planetary stewardship that has been kind of thrown around in different circles. And sometimes it comes in the form of the idea of taming Gaia. And I'd like to kind of reflect critically upon that a little bit and then say that instead we should maybe look at multi-species sustainability, because our well-being is really interdependent, and it's maybe not about taming. But the real focus of the presentation then will be in how to engage with modern human agency and how to maybe collaborate with earthly intelligences by looking at 3 principles of multi-species sustainability: absorbing variety, operational autonomy, and anticipating futures. And I'd like to then wrap up the talk by thinking through the possibility of using art and art research to get closer towards arts of living and make an appeal to jointly develop the idea of planetary gardening as opposed to taming Gaia. So to start out with, I think most people listening today are aware of that we are in a deep, deep crisis of sustainability, that currently we have developed really arts of living off of nature, of exploiting nature, when we should have been developing arts of living with nature. And I'll not go into detail, but it really bears to remember that we are looking at the result of capitalism, the result of colonialism, and as we are recently seeing again in Europe, the results of imperialism. And of course, there are other isms as well at play: racism, sexism, patriarchy, exploitation, and so on. And it really is important to keep that in mind when we think about earthly intelligence, when we think about planetary stewardship, because today it's really come to this, that Earth is now on the table and is being carved up. So what should we make of proposals then that are saying we should be taming Gaia? Well, let's think about it. The idea of taming, of mastering, of fixing, of managing has been historically applied to people, to women, to non-humans. And this is really what our current exploitative system is built on. And Western science especially has played a core role in this, has really facilitated this. And if we stick with this idea of taming Gaia, I think Western science is really failing to abandon the mode of operation that has caused this whole crisis. And if we look closer, one of these modes of operation is the classic first order cybernetics thinking, that you use the levers in the system and focus on control. How can we control the system top down so it does what we want? But if we continue to use this kind of logic to kind of try to tame climate change, tame the responses that Gaia is having to climate change, etc., then what we are doing, what planetary stewardship and Earth system governance, etc., are risking to do is to simply perpetuate the systems of exploitation that have caused this crisis. And to look at, for example, the planetary boundaries, what it also does is it simplifies the Earth system in its whole complexity in a way that tricks us into thinking that we can kind of optimize our use of the Earth system in a way that in a different field might be called optimal resource exploitation. So that we can really go up to the planetary boundary and then just stay there and manage the whole Earth system in a way that we don't cross the boundary and still kind of can reap the most benefits that are possible. And the problem here is that we really need to resist this kind of reductionism. What we are doing very often is we make the world simple because it's easier to deal with that way. But what gets kind of thrown under the bus here is the complexity that's out there, the complexity in the relations between us and nature, the relations between different species that make up the whole Earth system. And I think we really need to resist that reductionism. And that starts in the kind of thinking, in the kind of frame that we're using to understand Earth and earthly intelligence. And what I found to be really, really useful is the frame of multi-species thinking, because it replaces the kind of dualist ontologies that are still prevalent in our thinking with a relational perspective by highlighting the intersections between ecological relations, but also between political economy and between cultural representations. And I think we've already had a little bit of this in the previous presentation, but if we really want to understand both other species and ourselves, then I think we need to recognize the agency of non-human species. And I wouldn't stop at primates or fish. I would simply argue that there are different forms of agency. And from there, then we can start to build a theoretically integrated, holistic kind of account of human lives, of landscapes, of technologies. And that gives us the tools to then think through the interconnected and inseparable ways of human and other than human well-being. And so in work we've done on sustainability, we said, okay, let's try to visualize these complexities. Let's not simply write environment and then economy and then society, but let's see if we can tease out the dependencies here. And then we see that the formal economies, the human economies, are really dependent on all of these other societies out there. We can do the same for agency. We can see that the Earth system, including our cities, including landscapes, and including our own bodies, are really affected by a wide variety of different agency, of shared agency that together makes the Earth system. And our own agency that we are used to holding up so high, as has been very, very clear in the last presentation, is really only one type of agency that's affecting the Earth system. So based on that, we tried to come up with a new definition of sustainability. And I think you could call multi-species sustainability an attempt to get at arts of living with. And we said that it means meeting the diverse, changing, interdependent, and irreducibly inseparable needs of all species of the present, while enhancing the ability of future generations of all species to meet their own needs. So instead of looking at how one species' needs can be met through exploitation of the rest, we acknowledge that there are many needs out there, and these are inseparable and interconnected. 6 principles kind of go into that, and I will only look at 3 of these today, but the notions are multi-species well-being and the need of multi-species stakeholders arising from this, the need to enhance ability over time, because it's very, very hard to get ability to meet needs back once you've lost it. And then finally, absorbing variety, operational autonomy, and anticipating futures. And I'll look at these in more detail now. So what we're getting at here is that we really need to think about how can we collaborate with earthly intelligence. And the need arises through the complexity of the Earth system. Moving away from first order cybernetics, which is focused on control, to second order cybernetics, which is focused on things like autopoiesis and self-regulating systems, there's a lot to learn here. First, if we think about dynamic nested ecosystems and their complexity, it becomes very quickly very obvious that these are too complex to control top-down. And this has been already formalized over 50 years ago in the law of requisite variety. If you want to control something, then your control system needs to have at least as much variety as the system you want to control. And if we think about it, how much variety would a planetary control system require? So a whole lot. What do you do? Let's look at the mainstream solutions. The mainstream solutions are reduce the variety, make it easier to control. And that results in what Haraway and Singh, for example, have called the plantationocene. You make everything look the same. You actively negate the individual differences, the personality, the theory of the mind, etc. All of this kind of stuff gets eradicated because it gets into the way of managing. What are then the alternatives to this? And this is where the second order cybernetics really comes into it. The first thing is, instead of simply reducing variety, you try to absorb variety. And here I draw on some of the research that Daniel has done on the geosystems. You think about multi-species well-being and its complexity. And what you try to avoid is the reductionism and the anthropocentrism that tricks us into thinking that we as humans must manage the whole ecosystem or the whole earth alone. This is really a kind of breathtaking hubris, I would say, when experience tells us both that that both of these kind of ideas that we can manage and that we must manage alone are wrong. Historically, that's not how people have lived with the landscape. Modern human co-stewardship has been key to success in countless human activities. You work with the plants, you work with the bees here, for example, and together you become co-stewards of the landscape. How do you do that? You do that by making sure the actors on the ground have operational autonomy. Because what you require is you require adaptive management and self-regulative management. And to make that happen, these kind of systems need to rely on the modern human agency, or what here in the symposium has been called earthly intelligence. What do we know about other species' needs? Why should we have to fully understand other species' needs when we instead can try to make sure that they have the means necessary to meet their own needs? So what has been done historically, and what I think is really, really important to focus on going forwards, are policies and practices that restore and foster operational autonomy, not just for the people living on the ground, but also for the other species on the ground. And practices like agroecology, lately rewilding, but also kind of non-domestication, or what has been called wild keeping of animals, really goes into that direction. Japanese honeybee keeping here is a really fascinating example, because unlike Western industrial kind of honeybee keeping, where you control the reproduction of the bee, you simply, in the Japanese traditional honeybee keeping, you simply put out a hive, and then you hope that the wild bees will find it nice enough to come and stay there. And your job is to make sure that they are having a good time, because if they are having a good time, it means at the end of the day, there will be honey left for you to harvest. And the fun thing is that if you are not doing a good job, the honeybees will simply go away and will let you know that you need to do better. So instead of trying to control the whole process and making it about a top-down exploitation, it can be a mutually beneficial arrangement. And this is something that I think needs to be replicated and adapted to all different kinds of ways of interacting with nature and ecosystems. The third principle I would like to talk about before we move on to the art is anticipating Earth futures. Different species have different anticipatory capacities. If you're not interested, or if you haven't heard about this field of anticipation, it's actually quite interesting. You might not think that species other than humans actually think about the future. And yes, depending on what species you look at, future thinking takes different forms. But there are different anticipatory capacities across species. Thinking ahead, learning, even provisioning for future needs by saving food or even tools is not something that is limited to humans. Birds can do it, and every month there's new papers, new research that discovers new kind of anticipatory capacities. So this is a field that is rapidly evolving, I would say. And what if we could combine these kind of modern human anticipatory capacities with a repurposed human anticipation, where currently we are kind of using our skills to think about the future to find ways of differently exploiting and better dominating the Earth system. This is exactly the kind of taming Gaia idea that I think is repeatedly getting us into trouble. And if we repurpose that and complemented with modern human anticipatory capacities, in what ways could we maybe combine earthly intelligences to together chart brighter futures? And this is an idea that I've recently, together with colleagues, explored in this science fiction anthology, where we think about multi-species cities through science fiction, through different ways of engaging with other species. But let's not stop at the research. I think one of the kind of barriers that keeps us from really making a breakthrough in this kind of area is the limits that we pose our own imagination. So what I'm lately trying to do in my work is I'm trying to find collaborations where we can really together explore ways of overcoming these barriers to imagination. And of course, this is what traditionally art has been doing for society. And the way that art and humanities have been devalued in funding, in research, etc., is really reflected in the way that we are lacking good ideas for how we want to move forward. And we see this in our institutions all across the board. So what I want to show here to kind of wrap up the presentation is what I call art to research arts of living, and a collaboration I've been doing with a concept artist who's specializing in creature art called Solar Punk Creatures. And the idea is here that in our art, we together explore ways that interspecies or cross-species negotiations lead to future different urban arrangements of livings. So here are 3 examples. One is Moth City, where the setting is kind of a human moth joined city, which is not just all about nice coexistence, but which involves hard negotiation. Another one, the idea of microbes has been raised in the questions earlier, tries to address both ways of dealing with the plastic trash killing our oceans, and ways that humans can kind of engage with this very strange, and to our way of thinking, very foreign earthly intelligence. And finally, we also take a dive into the ocean and engage with some of the really fascinating and intelligent creatures that, for example, octopuses are. And I realized that this is by far not the best way of conveying this kind of art. With apologies to the listeners from abroad, if you are in Japan, from next month you can take a trip to see this exhibition, where the art that I've just shown will be exhibited as well, alongside a lot of other very fascinating work around rethinking our cities, rethinking our lives, in light of the new research that has come out across, well, microbes and the microbiome. So to finish, based on this kind of thinking, I think what we need are really arts of planetary gardening for multi-species sustainability. We need to reimagine our arts of living with nature, with earthly intelligences. And the first step to do that will be to first acknowledge indigenous knowledge and practices. And that, of course, includes simply giving some of the land back that has been stolen, but also to acknowledge multi-species agency, because this is the kind of agency that we've been dealing with and that we need to deal with if we want to kind of go towards gardening earth. And this is something that every gardener knows and is doing in their daily gardening activities. So it's not a foreign thing that we need to invent from scratch. It's something that we have been doing for a long time. But it's something that should be based not on taming, not on trying to control, which often is very futile, as every gardener will tell you, but it should be based on the ideas of co-creation, of negotiation, of coexistence, of mutual respect, and finally, of course, of caring for and being cared for. And here are 4 books that I think can provide a very, very nice starting point for this kind of thinking. So with that, I'd like to thank you and look forward to your questions.
Okay, Christoph, thank you very much for your presentation. I was interested by a number of the points that you make there. And unfortunately, we are coming, I have to manage the time a bit closely, and so I'm torn between how to proceed exactly. But I thought maybe I would just ask you, since your exhibition is going to open next month, would you say a little bit about how you engage some of these ideas in that exhibition, especially for people who are not able to visit in person? Tell us a little bit more about the vision of that exhibition, if you would.
Right. So first, I should say that it's it's not my exhibition, unfortunately. So I'm just one of the collaborators. It's part of the Visionary Lab theme that the Midaikan has, and the visionary for this exhibition is a microbiome researcher and startup entrepreneur. And so the whole exhibition really tries to tackle the way that microbiome research and the understanding that microbes really are all around us and within us is changing our view of ourselves, our view of our environment, and our view of the connection. And to describe a little what the space will look like, the exhibition will feature, you will come into the room and there will be a kind of open house where you can go into and explore the house, and the house will show you how even in your own house you are constantly living together with microbes. And then as you kind of learn about the microbiome and microbes and the way you interact with them, you can engage both with the art, for example, that I showed earlier, but there's also a whole short novel written about this idea, a science fiction novel that has been created for this exhibition. And the exhibition kind of then wraps up when you come to the end with a garden, with an indoor garden that a friend of mine that I've been collaborating with, Yoshida Aoi, has been involved with, where we kind of show that even indoors you can have this kind of garden where there are constantly microbes at work, plants at work, shaping the air, producing microbes that will go into the air, meaning that if you go to the exhibition, you will leave it a changed person, literally. And I'm looking very much forward to visiting myself.
Great. Sounds fascinating. Sounds great. And I love this idea that you are participating actually as a part of the exhibition, changing it and also being changed by it at the same time. That is fascinating. So Christoph, thank you very much. I know you, I hope that you can hold on
Sure.
because maybe we have some time at the end for some joint conversation. But now I'd like to turn to our third and last presentation today, which comes to us from Geneva, Switzerland. Damien KUNIK, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Okay, hello, welcome. Great, thank you very much for joining us this morning. I know it's very early for you, and so I appreciate the energy that you have to arrive all the way there from 4 in the morning. Damien, you are now the curator for the Asian collections at the Museum of Ethnography in Geneva, Switzerland. You are anthropologist by training, I believe, and I know that you spent a few years just down the road in Osaka at the National Museum of Ethnology there.
Yes.
Now, that's nice because the National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka and the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Kyoto are sister institutes. We are both members of the National Institutes for the Humanities, so it's nice to see that we can continue our collaboration here today. And I'd like you, please, if you would, just to begin your presentation on shared responsibilities, negotiating standards of behaviors between human and non-human. Please.
Yes, yes, thank you for the introduction. I'm just sharing my screen now. It's, yeah, okay, it should be working. Yes. Okay, so thank you for the introduction. Yeah, it's early, but I'm okay. Thank you. So let's start right here. So yes, in the age of the Anthropocene, this idea of shared responsibilities between humans and the broad realm of the non-human carries much more than a symbolic meaning. And there's an ethical debate that nowadays informs even legal documents. I'm not talking about that, but it should be acknowledged. And so to me, this active maintenance of good relations with the different elements making up the ecosystem, broadly speaking, that is material and spiritual, living and non-living, has become pivotal in the sustainable management of resources, past, present, and future. I'm talking as a museum professional today, and in regard to museums, and museums of ethnology in particular, past and present resources held within the walls of the institution. I'm talking here about what is commonly called heritage. These resources might be the first one that spring to mind. This bears a strong relation to the future, though, and I'll get back to it. To begin with, this topic of shared responsibilities between human and non-human is a major chapter of the current temporary exhibition held at the MEG, the Museum of Ethnography in Geneva. The title of the exhibition, as you can see, is Environmental Injustice, Indigenous Peoples Alternative. So the exhibition explores various indigenous groups' views on the matter and their concrete application in the everyday. I'm not the head curator for the exhibition. I was part of the team. That's actually my first exhibition here in Geneva. To introduce you to the exhibition, I'm about to share a very short film that presents the work done here in Geneva, and I'll briefly describe what the project is about. But before I do that, let me explain how we work, because it's absolutely central. We could very simply say that it all started with a principle. You can read it here. Our museum seeks to establish a mutually supportive and collaborative relationship, recognizing the rights affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including Article 11, 12, 31. The museum recognizes the overarching principle of free, prior, and informed consent, what we call FPIC. In short, nothing in the exhibition was done without the collective validation of many stakeholders, including obviously many representatives of indigenous groups, and also NGO workers, artists, lawyers, etc., who took an active part in the design of the exhibition. So this collective exercise in validation, which was a little perilous, nevertheless allowed us to highlight something that we have seen gradually emerge. This is the question of interconnectedness. While working on the exhibition by multiplying voices, histories, by multiplying ontological conceptions, by multiplying manifestations of struggles for land and environmental rights, and explanations of why these struggles occur, we come to see that nothing can be explained by itself. The environmental crisis is linked, obviously, to imperialism and colonial endeavors. The protection of the environment among indigenous groups is directly linked, related to the struggle for recognition of other philosophical conceptions of the relationships between human and nature, between human and non-humans, between the living and the inert, and last but not least, between the exploitation of resources that contravenes the agreements of shared responsibilities between the different entities that inhabit the planet. So the central message of the exhibition is therefore that the environmental crisis is essentially the most visible aspect of a crisis, but only one aspect of a crisis of interconnectedness that goes far beyond the mechanistic and extractivist reading that we most obviously have in the West or in Western cultures. So let's start with the film. To orient you a bit, I can already inform you that the exhibition is divided into 5 chapters. All I have is that little movie in French. We won't have time to dive in every chapter today, but I'm speaking as the film goes, and that's yeah. That gives you a brief overview of the exhibition. So this exhibition is based on 2 observations. One is that that's a fact. Indigenous peoples represent 6% of the world's population. That's 500 million people. And for many of them, most of them, climate change is more than ever a reality. The second observation, and this is what we try to prove here. So the evidence collected and presented seeks to demonstrate by example that when indigenous peoples, indigenous groups own and control their lands, the environment, the biodiversity, and cultures are better protected. Another chapter, and this is what I'm talking about here today, is this chapter on shared responsibilities. So human and non-humans have shared reciprocal responsibilities towards each other. In this relational perspective, a salmon, a river, a tree, a mountain, but also artifacts are animate partners. And indigenous groups claim that the important role they can play in finding alternatives to protect resources, living and non-living, for future generations. And then we're moving to what we see now. We call it the time of crisis. So when the equilibrium, when balance is no longer maintained, crisis sets in. The continued destruction of land and carbon emissions accelerate the climate crisis, which in turn accelerates land degradation, which in turn accelerate cultural degradation. And many indigenous groups claim that they still live in a colonial relationship with the state in which they are located. So without prior consultation or consent, these states often prioritize economic growth, such as mining, hydroelectric projects, etc., on lands traditionally occupied by indigenous groups. And when this type of growth is prioritized, there's a whole cultural machine that has to be created by the land grabber, by the colonizer, and set in motion to justify the land grabbing. It might actually be the case of Museum of Ethnography as well. And so the exhibition ends on a final chapter that we call the time for encounters. And so the exhibition ends with a time for encounters, inviting the public to see, hear, and listen to the testimonies of indigenous experts and artists. And why not to take a stand together, joining with indigenous peoples to weave a common future based on the value of care, reparation, and responsibility for all forms of things, I should say, of life. So this is it for the general introduction of the exhibition. I would like to come back to a few specific points that I hope will inspire you. On the issue of interconnectedness and shared responsibilities, at the center of the exhibition is an artwork by two Tsimshian artists that you can see here, David Boxley and Gavin Hudson. So just to say it quickly, the Tsimshian are one of the First Nations of the Pacific Northwest coast of the American continent. The Tsimshian themselves are located in Alaska. They moved, they were located around Seattle, and they moved to Alaska at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is the artwork. So the work features 4 masks, which are the personification of 4 actors. A little boy that is called the prince, a mask of a fish, the king of the salmon people, a mask of a river, and a mask of a tree, which is who is the king of the forest. And when you put on the mask, you can see that you can put the mask on. The installation allows you to hear the same story told by these 4 actors. So the story goes quickly said like that. The kid, the little boy, the prince, lives in a group that fishes salmons from the river, from the nearby river, and the group is overfishing. And for this reason, the salmon people come to the kid and they take it hostage for 5 years. And during these 5 years of captivity, they explain to the kid that if his people overfish, the salmon will die, but the humans will die as well, because there will be no fish left. And the same story is then told through the voice of the river. And the river explained to the little boy that the river is here for a reason. The salmon live in there, but the river brings water to the humans as well. And then the story is told through the voice of the tree, and the tree explains to the little boy that the salmon can lay their eggs on the roots of the tree that goes into the river, and the water goes through the tree and up in the leaves and evaporates and go and forms clouds, and clouds come down as rain, and rain becomes river again. So in short, and this is easy enough to understand, humans and non-humans share the planet, and each have responsibilities to their own group, but equally to other groups. However, when one of these actors acts at the expense of the other for its own benefit, the balance is broken, and the whole system threatened to collapse. So now, this is an exhibition. At face value, it is about the current climate crisis. Does it relate to museum work? Because that's what I'm here to talk about. And if so, how does it relate to museum work, or rather to the future of museums, of ethnology? So let me give you another seemingly unrelated example taken on Japanese soil. Yes. So this is what is known in Japanese as chasenkuyo. So in English, I would translate that as a funeral ceremony for tea whisks. You can see the tea whisk on the left hand side of the picture. Here's another image. So yes, if tea whisks can benefit from a funeral ceremony, this puts them, the whisks, on another plane of existence. From inert artifacts, they somehow become imbued with something akin to life. If objects can die and receive a respectful nod as dead objects, could it mean that they have been alive as well? So defining the word alive is quite tricky, actually. Philosophy, religions, anthropology, biology, all have their own definition of what alive means, and they quite often contradict with each other's. What appeared clearly in the design of our exhibition is that the vast majority of the artifacts we hold and present as a museum of ethnology can be considered alive, at least through the lens of the indigenous groups that helped us set the exhibition up. We have objects that should be fed water or tobacco. We have objects that should own their place in the interconnectedness of human and non-human relations. We have objects that live and die, that interact with people, even when they're dead or put to death, and put, how should I say, entombed or buried in the soil, where archaeologists or anthropologists can, although sometimes shouldn't, dig them up. So there is a cycle of life with objects, and these live artifacts end up in museums in a form of unrequested purgatory. That's what I call the purgatory of museum storage and glass cases for, at best, an educational purpose of Western audiences. And here, the cycle of interconnectedness is broken. So it might not sound as readily threatening as global warming or sea rise or land grabbing or the disappearing biodiversity. But still, this is part of a broken cycle and the collapse of shared responsibilities. And therefore, inspired by this approach of interconnectivity since the inception of the exhibition in 2019, our museum has deeply reassessed its curatorial and heritage management practices toward the ethnographic collection, the artifacts we hold in our walls. The question has been for us who hold other people's material cultures and cultural assets, what is it that we can do? What is it that we should do? And the answer we are starting to actively collect is that the relationship between humans and artifacts, and more broadly between Western audiences and indigenous claims of property, should be repaired. We should, as a museum, redefine what education means, not only to locally present other cultures' materiality for itself, not to present the mere exotic beauty of objects or the surprising function or simply a testimony of things past, but we should engage with artifacts for their interconnectedness with the bigger picture of human and non-human relations on the planet. And so an outrigger canoe or a pouch made of other skin or animal skin, or in our example here, a tea whisk, tells us more than what has been registered in the museum files and their archives. It tells us about interconnectedness. It doesn't, if we take a tea whisk, for example, it doesn't only tells us about the long cultural history and aesthetics of tea in Japan, but also about human and artifacts relation, and these dwindling relations, because for example, the funeral ceremony for tea whisk are disappearing today. So this dwindling relation to objects is a manifestation of lost connectivity. So by addressing the question, it might be that some objects will be lost to museum because of when we engage with the groups whose materiality or whose objects they belong to, we may lose some objects. Yeah, because of what we can broadly define as repatriation or the reinsertion of artifacts in the cycle of life. But even from this loss, much can be learned and much can be repaired if we are to adhere to this overarching principle of free, prior, and informed consent. And so for those of you interested in how we intend to achieve it, and actually we have no idea how we'll achieve it. And we're a small museum, so what we'll achieve in the end will take place at a very small scale. But to give you some ideas, I'm sharing with you, and I'll end my presentation on that slide. So there's a link down the page related to how we wish for different groups to interact with our collections. This is an invitation to non-museum professionals to discuss the future of our collections, to physically interact with them, and to breathe into them the life that is currently on hold because of the past cultural politics of museums that we now deem unsustainable on a symbolic, but also on a very tangible perspective. You'll find on the link an open list of guiding principles that I am not discussing here willingly for a good reason. Either you are interested in the matter or you have stakes in the matter, and no, either you don't have stakes in the matter. And I've told you all I can tell you about. I had spoke for more than 20 minutes now. If you do have stakes in the matter or are interested in the matter, it is much better to read these guiding principles and to directly engage with us here in Geneva. So we are welcoming every comment and demand through the link. And so, yes, please follow it if you are interested. I'm, concluding on that. I'm over and over time, so sorry for that.
That's okay. Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Damien, for your presentation. Yes, we're a little bit over time and actually coming almost to the end of the session. But, and so unfortunately, and I wonder if it's possible that we can bring back Christoph also on this screen, just in case. Yeah, there's just barely a moment to have a last word or two. But it seemed to me, Damien, that you, even though you focus on the collections of material culture objects held there in the museum, that you speak in some ways that are very much akin to our discussions earlier in the session. You said, for example, nothing can be explained by itself. And that much of our crisis today is a crisis of connectedness, or of broken connections. And the idea that the connections are not just between fixed objects, but between the human and the non-human, the living and the non-living, and in fact changing these ideas of what is living and non-living itself is an intellectual task, especially for us who inherit the categories of objects in certain boxes, ethnographic objects in one, scientific objects perhaps of a certain kind in another. And so it's very interesting the way that you connect those kind of ideas. And the idea, I think, if I just ask one quick question of you, how could you say a little more, since we have spoken about 2 exhibitions in this session, about the idea of presenting the life of things, the living objects? What does that do to the way that you think about the interaction that take place inside the museum between the public and the living things?
Yes, that's a very broad question, actually. The topic, so I've been interested in the life of objects for the past 20 years. And so some of you may know it already. I see Frédéric on the screen. This is not the topic of the exhibition. This is what we do of the exhibition. And there, I hope that there will be an exhibition specifically on the life of objects. What we are doing, what I'm doing now as a curator, is to try to collect opinions on the matter with the groups we worked with the indigenous peoples. I've always been working on East Asia and in Japan, where animism still exists in a way. But I can finally do comparative anthropology and engage with the groups that I haven't engaged with before. So this is the start of everything. Actually, I cannot answer your questions. I've used this exhibition to start discussing the matter with many groups around. So maybe I should come back here in 5 years and present another exhibition to answer your question.
Okay, we will look forward to that. Yes, I'm sorry, that's a very, very broad question, but maybe then I shall end instead on the idea that you left, that the salmon, the tree, the mountain, the soils are all parts or involved in a cycle of independence. And this seemed very close to the ideas that were presented also by Christoph in his discussion of multi-species sustainability, the idea of collaborating with a kind of earthly intelligence, and also his interesting example of the bees acting as, in a way, the humans create a nice place for the bees to live, but the bees have to choose to live there. And part of their choice to live there have also to do with their relationship to the land around, that there are enough pollinator plants available to them. That's okay. It's a good thing. And so anyway, this is just a very interesting idea to think about the way in which we focus on certain things, and they open up us into wider spheres of relationships, of interaction. Yes, so I am sorry that I have to rush ourselves just a little bit, but I will like to share finally my screen again in order just to bring to your attention the fact that we have at 7 o'clock this evening in Japan time, 11 o'clock in Central European time, 5 in the morning in Eastern Standard Time, and 7 o'clock, yes, 7 o'clock in, we have 30 more minutes. Wow, I'm sorry. I thought we were just at the end of this question time. Okay, I'm sorry. I was just concluding there, but I do not need to do that. So I cancel my screen share. My mistake. I am sorry. So we can continue then. Christoph, maybe would you like to offer any reaction to the way that Damien also speak about the interconnections of the world, just as I was doing a minute ago?
Well, for me, it was really, really good to see that, well, museums, which have been part of the way Western science is done, are really, really actively rethinking how they are doing their work, how they are engaging with their collections, how they're engaging with, especially with indigenous people. And because that's still, I think, a very, very difficult topic, and a topic that still requires a lot of work, especially in Japan. I mean, there has been a lot of heated debate in Japan around the relationship between national collections and the Ainu people. And I think for researchers, but also for, well, for curators, and probably for many, many other roles in society, we're just at the beginning of a really long and difficult period of rethinking the way of doing things, of how we approach the various kind of others that we've created through the way we've been doing things, whether it's other species or things. And for me, it was really fascinating to hear that this kind of work is ongoing, and that the museum has been, as you've been showing, kind of actively reworking its mode of operation. And I think that's something that we can learn from, I would say, speaking as someone based at a Japanese institution and previously based at a Japanese institution, where I think this kind of work is often difficult and takes a lot of time, and still is not, the importance of which is still not widely appreciated, especially at the higher level of management, I think. So I think that's a discussion that going forward needs to happen in the context of arts of living, because, well, our institutions are part of our arts of living, and it means that our institutions will need to change as well. And it would be really interesting to hear if you have some kind of insights in that regard, how your work has been like how your experience has been, for example, working in Japan and working abroad, like what kind of differences you see and feel there in the approaches.
Okay, many thanks for your comments. Regarding your questions, my work in Japan was very different from I was at the museum in Japan as well, but I was on the research side of, and I was working on my own research topic. So I was not that much engaged in the museum aspect of the museum I was working on. I was working in Japan, so I cannot really compare. Still, talking today with Japanese NGOs representing Ainu people, there seemed to be good relations. Okay, there are some things, yeah, you mentioned Ainu people. I'm not familiar enough with that topic to answer for them, and I'm not willing to answer for them. I can see, to me, the Minpaku is quite trend-setting in Japan in regards to engaging with indigenous peoples, but I should be prudent, careful not to. Okay, the answer is I don't know, actually. The answer is I don't know. I've loved my work at the Minpaku. I hope I will go back to Minpaku. But regarding the relation to indigenous peoples, I don't know how it's going properly in Japan. So I cannot compare. If you mind, I want to get back to what Daniel ended up with, and to connect between the two our two presentations, and regarding the bees especially. So Christoph explained that you have to make sure that the bees are happy for them to produce honey for the humans. That's really interesting, because I believe it's the same with objects, and that's what appeared in our exhibition as well. Many indigenous representatives told us as well that you have to make sure objects are happy within the realm of human beings. And so this is, so this is about connectivity between animals and humans, but also between objects and humans. I see no border between objects and living, what we consider living in the Western sense of the word. Because in many discussions I had with indigenous groups, there is no border. And even for what we could call dead objects, relation has to be maintained. And if the objects end up in a ditch or under the soil, and they still act as points of connection with the past, with ancestors, and digging them up will lead to a broken cycle. So that's why I offered this presentation on the life of objects here. That's because I believe there is no border between what we call living and non-living. I have also this example in Japan, so it's a bit symbolic, but still there are those demons or ghosts called tsukumogami in Japan, and it's all about keeping the relation alive with objects. And when you throw the objects away without ceremony, the object turns into a demon and comes back to you and as a vengeful spirit. So you have to make sure that objects are happy within the realm of humans as well. So that was my what popped to mind when I heard you talking about the bees, Christoph.
Yes, that's very interesting, and I think we have a question from Frederick Julian coming in on the Zoom. Is it possible for us to go to him directly? Yes. So
yes,
Frederick. Good. Can
you
you
hear
please?
me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So good morning, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, both of you, for your talks and presentation. Very challenging and very interesting. I have just one global comment on and perhaps a question to Damien on the future of natural history museum, because all around the planet, natural history museums are just dealing with different type of multi-species, in fact, facts and objects, and they are in fact thinking for the future of their visibility, and I would say in fact the how to live colonialism period, and how to rearrange collections. So and one way I do work with the Musée in France, traditional art in Europe and in France, and that's what is still missing. In fact, it's activities, it's gestures, it is process. We are dealing with collections, with objects. But what we want to explain, to show to people, and to, in fact, to make research on, it is the processes behind the objects. So, and perhaps it's a question for Damien, how do you deal with this question? How you face the heritage, object collection, and all what we can do with the knowledge. We share together a museum, a favorite museum in Kobe on carpentry, and we are fond of this museum because it's a place where we can see action, makers at the same time, and objects. How we can deal with big museum with this question. So that's a big topic, of course, but we everywhere we are facing, and we are just a little bit, I would say, stuck with the question of objects versus processes and gesture, and the change can come from the new type of presentation, and how to make all those collections alive again, as you present.
Yes, so yeah, that's a big question, obviously. What can we do? So to begin with, you talked about natural history museums. We just had a talk a few days ago. It's online on the Museum of Ethnography here in Geneva website, so you can check it if you're interested. But we had a talk with two First Nation artists of North America several days ago, and they used the example of natural history museums to explain how wrong we are in the Museum of Ethnography as well. So they took the example of birds. You have birds, and so proper birds stuffed with the hay or whatever they stuff birds with in a Museum of Natural History. So if you go to the museum and look into the case, you'll see a dead bird. So you can notice the colors of the feather, you can notice the shape of the beak, you can notice the size of the bird. But what matters is lost, because this is only part of the what we can learn about the bird. You won't learn about how it dances. You won't learn about how it flies. You won't learn about how it interacts with other birds, and how it hunts for seeds or fruits or whatever. And to those two artists, this is what the bird is all about. It's not about its color. It's about its behavior with its environment. And so they use this example to say that this is exactly the same for objects. We may have axes or pipes or totem poles or whatever, but we only have a dead representation of axes and pipes and totem poles. This is not what a totem pole is about or an axe is about. Axe is meant to be used. It's meant to be whacked at a tree or whacked at a nut or whatever. And we have lost everything in putting this in a glass case. So what should we do? We should go back to gestures, as you just said. And now that we have those dead examples of artifacts, of birds, of animals in museums, at least we should use them to talk about gestures. It might have, in their views, it has been wrong to even display them in museums. And the whole concept of museum is foreign to them. But they acknowledge the fact that it's as it is today, at least to repair, and I'm using that symbolic expression, to repair the cycle of connectivity. We should at least use that as an example to come back to gestures. So yes, we do love, both of us, that museum in Kobe on carpentry tools. That museum is doing a wonderful work of explaining gestures and explaining the connectivity between humans and trees, between humans and matter, that is wood in this instance. And so at least use what we let's use what we can use to come back to the cycle of life, to gestures, to to connectivity. And also, so we cannot revive a dead bird, but we can revive some of the objects Museum of Ethnography hold. And reviving them can take many forms. Either we can, they can be, objects can be reanimated. This has happened recently at the Museum of Ethnology. Some objects, and this is quite new in terms of heritage management. We took objects out of the storage rooms, and cultural groups reused them. And so there's the whole matter of repatriation as well. Some objects should be returned to a country. So this is quite easy in Switzerland. It's much harder in France. I'm not sure about heritage laws in Japan. But Switzerland is allowed to return objects without it contravening heritage laws in Switzerland. And so we don't know what we don't know what will happen to these objects. Maybe they will be burnt, or they will be destroyed once returned. But still, we can learn from that. If we put the life of these objects on hold by keeping them in museums, and the objects are returned and they are destroyed by their true cultural owners, we can still, as anthropologists, look at what is happening when the cycle of life and death of objects is restored. So this is what we can do. And this is what we are about to do at the museum here in Geneva. So I cannot answer for my colleagues in natural history museums. They'll have to find their own answers and engage with different communities to answer these questions. But there are ways out. Nobody's worried about ways out. And what will happen to museums, I don't know. But yeah, it will happen. Whether we like it or not, just like we have to change our behaviors toward the environment, because the global warming is coming. We'll have to act anyway.
Okay, thank you, Damien. Yes, you are working on bringing the objects out of their purgatory, as you say. And I thank you, Frederick, for that question. And I think we have a question also from Terada-san. And he is here on Zoom. Can we go to Terada-san, please?
Well, thank you very much, Damien and Christoph. Already Christina is not here, I think that I'm interested in the problem of border and distinction between things and human being and living being. So, and also the Damien's presentations make me think about the term of naturalism, which is I remember that Philip Descola criticized the term of naturalism. It is equivalent to the animism and totemism. That is only the one dimension of the four opposite of logical opposites. So today, this symposium theme is a term of nature. So what we define the nature is the problem of the naturalism itself. So I think that your presentation touched the point. And I would like to ask the question about the personality or how to think about personal entity in terms of the thing and living thing and human being. I already questioned to raise question to Christina about the empathic personality. And also, I would like to ask Christoph RUPPRECHT about the future of the how to define the personality in future. In your presentation, you introduced the graphic chart of the future novel in which the moth is described as the personality and the microbe is described in the personality. Is this the personality of its entity or it is the personality of the species? So how to define that personality is the key to how to describe the entire history of Earth. For example, in the Anthropocene, it is a question how to define the Earth history as itself. Today, I think that Tim Ingold may talk about its thing, the relationship of stone and the sun in the animals. So how to define those, in order to write history, the personality is necessary. So how can we deal with it? Christoph, if you have any idea about it's a future story, but if you have some implication, it is will be thankful.
Thanks for the question. Well, I don't think the art about the microbes actually does try to give them personality or anything like that. But as with the border between objects and living things, I'm not sure it is fruitful, and I'm not sure it is possible to try to draw a line and to say, okay, up until here, the species, the individuals of the species have personality, and beyond this line, there's no personality. I would argue that personality is something that A, is overrated, and B, is maybe a tool for us to understand the world and to try to explain each other's behavior. And as we are learning more about human behavior, we are learning that our own personality may be very much affected by the microbes that are living within us. So is it our personality? Or is it their personality? Or is it something that emerges out of the interaction between us and our microbes? So it's really difficult even for humans to pinpoint where their personality comes from. And I have to say, I haven't really thought about the issue that you've brought up in terms of what it means for writing or understanding history. And I'm not a historian, so this is something that I'd like to take home and think about. But as with personality, or like as Christine said, like the theory of the mind, I think in dealing and engaging and in negotiating with more than humans, whether it's living or non-living things, there are lots of traps to fall into that are not helpful, actually. And like being hung up with, for example, personality might be just as dangerous or as unhelpful as being hung up as with things like self-consciousness. And like a lot of these things that as we learn more about humans, become more and more difficult to actually pinpoint and understand and prove they actually exist. And like, it's much more interesting for me to see how our human experience might be enriched through thinking about how other living things or non-living things might interact with or experience the world, and then to see if our own experience might be artificially limited. And maybe there are ways, thinking about this session as being about sensing, I think it was in the wording about how we can sense Earth, that there are still realms of sensing the Earth that we as in Western science have been ignoring, that we need to rediscover. And in that regard, I think sometimes it feels like everything has been researched, but sometimes to me it feels like nothing has been researched, and there's so much work still left to do, which is great, because lots of fun to be had still in that regard. And well, historically different ideas about personality, and so I wouldn't try to get hung up on like one concept like that, and still maybe try to go from A to B through other means, like the direct path, see if there maybe are detours that are worthwhile, and in the process learn more about the problem of personality.
Oh, great. Thank you, Christoph, and thanks, Teresa-san, for that question. Now we are actually reached the real conclusion of the session. And so I would like to thank you all for your presentations and your papers to this idea of how to understand the interconnectedness of the world, how to understand the interdependencies of the world, and the ways in which, fascinatingly, understandings of interdependencies begin to call into question even some of our most fundamental categories that are typically used to understand the world, things like the living and the not living, things like the self and the other. These are certainly at the heart of the questions that we ask over the length of this symposium, and so I think you've done a very good job to get us going on that today. So thank you very much, Damien KUNIK from the University of the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva, Christoph RUPPRECHT from the University of Ehime, and Christine Webb at Harvard University for your papers today. It's greatly appreciated. And I finally share my screen just very quickly. Yes. In order to bring your attention to our session this afternoon. Certainly we will continue with these similar ideas. When at 7 o'clock in Japan time, 11 o'clock in Central European time, 5 o'clock in the morning at the Eastern Standard of North America. And we are very pleased to be able to welcome Tim Ingold and Augustin Burke, both of whom have worked at the intersections of culture and nature in both East and West for many decades, and they will be speaking together and with the facilitation of our colleague in Marseille, Frédéric Julien. And so we invite you to join us then. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your participations. Thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to seeing you in a few more hours. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.